Got a panel discussion today. Our scholar for the weekend, who is the lecturer tomorrow night, is Katharine Hayhoe. She has been giving presentations in Austin today and is hoping to get here before the panel presentation is over. But she, it's going to be touch and go to see what time she gets here. So if she doesn't make it, we've got three incredible panelists who will carry the day for us. I want to introduce each of them, but I want to start us out with a word of prayer. So if you'll join me, please. Our Father, we're thankful to you right now. We pray that over the next sum of time that we've got, you'll give us clear hearing, sharp insight, and a quick heart to learn and to seek to be better servants of you. And we pray these things in your name. Amen. And so with that, I'm going to get started. And I will start introducing with Elaine Ecklund. Elaine, would you come on up here? Elaine, join me in thanking Elaine for being here. You just got a handout on her latest book published by Oxford. But Elaine is the Herbert, do we say Herbert or Hebert? I mean, we're close enough.
I think we're in the U.S.
Herbert.
Yeah.
Well, if you're in southern Louisiana, it could still be Hebert. The Herbert Autrey Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and founding director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. She's also a scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. She's got at least 5 books that I know of. She's got at least 70 research articles that I know of. She's received grants and awards from organizations the world over. Her work's been cited over 4,000 times by national and international media outlets. So we are honored and delighted. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Next, I'm going to call up Chris Doran. Christopher Doran taught at two of our daughters that went to Pepperdine University. This is not Chris's first time. He's been here before. We're delighted to get him out from Pepperdine. A wreck on the Pacific Coast Highway almost caused him to miss his flight, but he is here nonetheless. Chris is an associate professor of religion at Pepperdine University. His research and teaching has been in a variety of areas related to the interaction of theology and science. His current work focuses on developing theological responses to climate change and its effect on human and non-human creatures as well as the rest of creation. He graduated from Seaver College, which is Pepperdine's undergraduate school, with a degree in biology. He has a Master's of Divinity from Pepperdine and then completed his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in 2007, and that was in systematic and theological philosophy. Now, he's got a book that came out just about a year or two ago.
2 years ago, yeah.
2 years ago, entitled Hope in the Age of Climate Change. He's currently working on being sustainable through frugality, good for the soul, the neighbor, and the earth. We do have some bottles, plastic bottles of water. We would ask that everybody keep theirs and refill it at the sink for at least a week or two. And he brought his own. Well done. Practice, walking the walk, not just talking the talk, I believe is what we call it. And last but not least, someone who I hope will be a feature lecturer for us next year, so that you need to start getting your it's going to take you more than a year to read everything he's written, is Douglas Moo. Join me in welcoming Douglas. Yeah, you're down there. He is the Kenneth T. Wessner Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College Graduate School. He has authored multiple commentaries on Romans, and some of the best writings on Romans you're ever going to see. And if you're not reading his works along with Tom Wright's works, then you're not getting a full rounded perspective on Romans. But in addition to that, he's written a number of other works, including with, I think, your son, the work Creation Care, A Biblical Theology of the Natural World. Now, before Doug was in Wheaton, he was the... He was over at like academic studies or something like that, but he was at Trinity Evangelical Divinity for over 20 years as well. Got his PhD from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, and he's quite the academic in exegesis as well as theology. He's good with Greek, and I don't, do you do Hebrew as well?
Is Dr. Averbeck here?
Yeah, Dick Averbeck is...
I dabble. I don't want him to test me. So.
All right. Well, if we have Hebrew questions, Dick Averbeck from Trinity Evangelicals back there teaches Hebrew, Ugaritic, and a few other stellar, interesting languages. And but anyway, we've got Doug as well. So if y'all will accept this as your panel, I am Mark Lanier. For those of you I've not met, welcome here. And I will be engaging them in dialogue. And so we begin. I won't ask your ages. But I will say, Chris, you may be too young for this. And Elaine, you look too young for
okay,
this.
Okay.
And Doug, this might be up yours and my alley. We lived in Rochester, New York. My mom's here. She'll remember those days. We lived in Rochester, New York in 1970-71. And an album came out that I'm still convinced if I'm on a desert island and I'm only allowed 10 records, this is one of the 10 I'm bringing. It was an album by a Motown artist who stepped out of his Motown genre, if you will, and produced an album that was entitled What's Going On. Marvin Gaye was the artist, and he had a song on there entitled the Ecology song. Mercy, Mercy Me is what you may know it as, where he was singing about the plight that was going on in our planet. And I went to Mom and I said, explain this pollution stuff to me. And Mom said, well, you need to read a book by Rachel Carlson, Silent Spring. I picked the book up much later in life. The book had been published in 1962. Very influential book to me. Rachel Carlson was able to, through that book, alert the United States to the tragedy that was happening worldwide because of the usage of DDT. It was affecting, sure, it would be used for crops and stuff, but the bugs that would die from it would be eaten by the birds, would be eaten by the fish, and eventually, was it DDT malathion? It was DDT, I believe. I may have the chemical wrong. Wasn't it DDT, Janet? You would know that. She called her book Silent Spring because her concern that the world would never be the same if we didn't stop the production and usage of this. And it did. But whether it's don't eat too much tuna, because tuna now has mercury in it, and it can't shed the mercury, as do most fish that are large-sized fish. That mercury is not naturally existing in the oceans. It's put there as a byproduct of what we do. And so within the framework of this, the environment's always been something that I've kept as an interest, and it's what captivates our discussion today. But I want to start the discussion with what captivated the interest of these folks on that subject matter. So we're going to start with the youngest and work our way out. Elaine, would you go first?
We're going to have a fight here, right?
My mom taught me the woman is always the youngest.
Okay.
Elaine, would you start us out? What got you first interested in matters related to the environment?
I don't want to copy your story, Mark, but I also read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This is a crazy thing. This is taking me back down memory lane, but when I was in college, as an easy job, I worked in our entomology library, so our bug library, And my job was to erase pencil marks from books when the students used that really scintillating work. I was actually fired from that job. It was the only job I
Wow.
tell my students that I couldn't pay attention well enough to erase pencil marks from books. They actually said I could not work in that job unsupervised. But the problem was that I read the books, and I remember erasing pencil marks from Rachel Carson's book, and I kind of got interested in that. I was raised in a Christian home, and it wasn't until much later that I started to think, why aren't Christians more interested in environmental care? So I had been always very interested in it. Like it sounds like we have this in common. My family had encouraged my interest in caring for God's earth, and we were farmers, and so I'd always loved the land and the earth and the beauty of the earth, and just had this innate interest in caring for the environment as a way of caring for God's creation. And I just, as a sociologist, all of a sudden started thinking deeply, why aren't Christians more broadly interested in environmental care? And so over the past 15 years or so, our team at Rice University has, among a number of scientific issues that we've been studying, I'm a sociologist, so I survey people, ask them questions on interviews, observe them in their congregations. One of the things that we've been interested in is trying to understand how different religious people see environment, environmental care, as well as climate change, and what are some of the ways that they justify, through the lens of their faith, whether or not they care about environmental care.
All right, and we're going to get into some of those questions because you have some interesting knowledge through your polling, your interviewing, and your work there that will not go unsolicited as we're in this group. But before we get there, Chris, we're going to bump down to you. Here you are. You've got this theology training, and you publish a book on... The name of the book is Hope in the Age of Climate Change. So what takes you from a systematician, a systematic theologian is someone who studies, if you will, all areas of theology, trying to integrate them into one coherent whole so that they all seem to mesh with some consistency. What takes you from that to being someone who's writing and publishing a great book on this issue of climate change? Where did you get interested in it at first?
I grew up in a city. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I spent times of my youth at an Arkansas farm of my grandparents. And so I spent time, not enough time, learning about humidity, because I came here today and I was a bit thrown off by how much humidity is in the air in this time of year. But the time I spent with my grandfather fishing, the time that I spent tending to the garden and doing those sorts of things were very influential to me. And then when I started teaching at Pepperdine in the summer times, I was a visiting person who was teaching during my grad career. I went to a quick seminar on religious responses to environmental care, and a Pepperdine administrator who's no longer there, he had made this big deal about how much Pepperdine was into recycling, was into this, and was into that. And as an alum, I knew he was totally full of it, that he was really fudging the data. And as a biology student, fudging the data is about the one cardinal sin that you cannot be forgiven for. And so I went home that night and started doing some research. I was teaching classes on evolution and genetics and some other things at that time. And I wrote a syllabus about what would it mean to take climate change seriously. And I taught it the very next summer, and that was probably 2005 or 2006, somewhere in there. And the students respond to it mightily. And the one thing that they responded to, that I keep finding they respond to, is just like I had been told in my home church that I was going to hell for being a biology student, they had been told that they were going to lose their faith if they thought climate change was real, and they believed the scientists. And to be a voice to those students to say, well, I have one strike against me for being a biology major. Now I teach about climate change. That's probably a second strike. I'll let God do the third strike at this point and take my chances. To have those students really respond to that, it meant to me that I was on to something. And on the theologian route, I was trained to deal with the world's great problems. And there's no greater world problem than climate change. And if I can't use my God-given gifts to help with the greatest, what I think is the greatest problem facing our civilization, then I don't know what being a Christian theologian is all about.
Okay, so we come to you, Doug. Now, I met Doug for the first time today. If any of you have been in my classes, you have benefited from Doug, as I have, because I've used his commentaries on Romans especially. But I've used a lot of his writings all of my life, adult life that they've been out there, I should say. Because he's a marvelous scholar. He'll dig into the Greek. He'll explain things in an exegetical fashion that makes a lot of sense to me. A Bible scholar's scholar is what he is. And I was stunned to find out he'd written a book on climate change. I thought, well, there's a story. How did you go from this bucket of biblical exegete into this world of writing about climate change? What is it that first tickled your interest? We'll get into the book in a little bit, but what is it that galvanized your attention?
Based on the progression you have made here in terms of age,
I'm start back at the beginning.
I'm tempted to say it was watching the dinosaurs die off. But my son, Jonathan, our oldest child, we have 5, for some reason grew up with a deep, deep love of nature. His brothers were into basketball, football, baseball. He was into hiking, fishing, hunting. Had this just innate love of the natural world that infected me a bit as he was growing up. He then went on to major in wildlife ecology before moving on to get degrees in theology. So ultimately we wrote the book together you mentioned on creation care, but it was really, number one, seeing his love of the natural world, and then digging into the issue myself when I first came to Wheaton College in 2002. We're required, new faculty members at Wheaton are required to write what's called a faith and learning paper. Now for most of the faculty it means they take their biology or psychology or whatever and integrate it with the Bible and theology. For us on the theology side, we've got to find something in the sciences or the arts to work on. So I thought, what a great opportunity to look at the way people are thinking about these environmental issues from a biblical and theological standpoint. So that's what really got me launched into that.
All right, as I've looked through y'all's writings, I've found it interesting to see what you choose to put into your books. And I think we may again start with you, Elaine. Your latest book, Elaine has polled scientists around the country and around the world on issues relevant to faith and religion. And it's interesting because she has disabused me of some preconceptions I had before I read your work, that basically we in the West, more so than other places, seem to have bought into this idea of science and faith being divorced from each other. And that it's a rare thing to find a scientist who also has a faith in God. Elaine, tell us how, as you got interested in that, how did you go about doing it? And then tell us, just take 5 minutes and tell us some of the conclusions and things that surprised you in your work. And I'd be interested to see if it's the same stuff that surprised me.
So there's 2 projects that our team has done at Rice through the Religion Public Life program that I think are relevant here. One is this study where we surveyed 22,000 scientists about their attitudes towards religion and faith and people of faith. in 8 different national contexts, and then we followed up and did face-to-face interviews with scientists, getting on planes, trains, automobiles, and are people old enough in this room to remember the reference to that movie?
Yes, we've got a lot of people in this room.
Okay. And we actually got, in people's laboratories and followed them around with little microphones and actually talked to them and tried to get them on tape talking about their faith backgrounds, how they see the connection between science and faith or not. Another project that our team has done is in the U.S., looking specifically at different faith communities, so looking at Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and also looking specifically at evangelical Christians, Catholics, and mainline Protestants, so the Methodists, Episcopalians, et cetera, in the U.S., and then doing congregational visits, and then doing interviews. So any student who works with me, regardless of their own faith background, gets to go to church a lot, because that's like what our studies are, is to go into churches and interview people. And trying to understand how faith communities within the U.S. view science, and especially scientists. So as related to the environment and climate change, it's hard to find scientists who do not think that there is human-caused climate change, okay? Now maybe others want to debate that, but I'm just telling you the perception, people's perception. So sociology is you ask people things on surveys, you interview them, you don't argue with them about whether or not you agree with them, you rather document what they say in their own terms. On the other hand, many, especially in faith communities, in particular evangelical Christian faith communities, do have concerns about environmental care. And they do have concerns in particular about whether or not human-caused climate change exists. And I'm happy to talk to you more about that. The specific things that really kind of surprised me about these studies is that that there's a real division between general environmental care, so just whether or not when you ask a Christian, do you think that it's a good idea to care for the environment? Does my faith even compel me to care for the environment? Most people think that their faith does compel them to care for the environment. I didn't think that would necessarily be the case. When I go to these scientific gatherings to present the research, they tend to think, the science community tends to think that's not the case, that Christians don't care very much about the environment. And so that's something surprising to me that I try to bring back to the scientific community. Climate change is a different kind of issue, and in part it has to do, from our surveys and our interviews, with the kind of trust that people place in the scientific community. So Christians love science, they do not necessarily love scientists. And so I want to make that, I love a scientist. Actually, I'm married to a scientist. My husband is a physicist, and he's a very committed Christian. So that has not been my background experience. I've met and interacted personally with lots of scientists of faith. But the general Christian sentiment is that there's maybe something a little bit suspicious about scientists. And so then any kind of ideas that maybe the scientist community is making too much out of climate science or climate change gets a little bit of traction, in part we find because of kind of generalized suspicion of the science community. Another issue that's quite important here is that climate change is much more connected to politics than generalized environmental care. I always tell my science friends, don't use Al Gore as your spokesperson. I actually have written an article called The Al Gore Effect. So there is a sense where this has become a very politicized issue, and I want to say I've found committed Christians who are Republicans and committed Christians who are Democrats and committed Christians who are independent. So I'm not trying to make a political assessment, but the issue of climate change has become highly politicized and connected with fairly left-leaning politics, and that has had a particular kind of impact on acceptance of climate science. So I actually tell, and these are kind of, the science community gets a little frustrated with me here, when scientists say, how can we reach the Christian community with ideas about climate change? I say, talk more about theology rather than politics. So actually making arguments about Christians' responsibility to care for the earth and care for one another are much more powerful arguments to be making than linking climate science or climate change or climate advocacy, rather, to political ideas.
Well, you have just given a tremendous segue. So I'm going to come back to you on something, but you've given such a good segue, I can't pass it up to Chris. So Chris, I was surprised when I was looking at your writings and working through your book to see the way, for example, you used resurrection hope and a theology of resurrection hope in terms of waking up the community to this concern. Tell us, as a theologian, how you speak about these issues that Elaine said we need to talk about theologically.
I think the reason I picked the resurrection as the center point for the book was that Paul says if it's not real, then we're all fools. So it's sort of the centerpiece of Pauline theology, even if we don't articulate it that way. And I grew up in a tradition that we didn't practice Easter Sunday all that much. It was sort of another Sunday just like any others. We all believed in the resurrection, but it wasn't really impacting our daily lives. And so what I talk about with my classes a lot, sort of piggybacking on what Elaine said, is that lots of people believe in environmental care or even talk about environmental stewardship, but I say, what are you doing in your daily life that actually shows that if you're a Christian? You know, it's easy to carry this around and feel really good about myself. It's much more difficult to say, should I get on a plane and fly to Mark's house? That's a much more difficult conversation. How far should I live away from my family? What are the real life kinds of things? And so as I start dealing with those, I thought, well, what is it that the resurrection does for me daily? And I looked to the early church witness in particular and realized it was such a source of hope for them in the sense of a confident expectation that God had won and that they now were to live as if God had won. And that made them courageous beyond belief, that made them generous beyond belief, that made them act in ways that the Romans just thought were bizarre, you know, like picking babies off the hillside, you know, like taking care of lepers when no one else would. And I thought to myself, that's the kind of Christian I want to be, where the resurrection transforms every bit of my life, all of my daily behavior, not just some of it. And so I thought, if I could convince Christians, particularly ones that are sort of in my orbit, more conservative, biblically based Christians, that the resurrection matters, no one's going to disagree with me, right? Everyone's going to say the resurrection matters. So then I thought, well, if I could get us all on board with something we already believe, maybe the next step would say, how do you live every day as if the resurrection matters? And I think that's a bit more tricky because most Christians believe in the resurrection but aren't necessarily connecting it to daily practice and how they are more courageous, more generous, more loving, etc. And so for me, that's the starting point of environmental care, is if the resurrection happened the way that we believe it did, it means that God's work is happening now, not into the future, and that our work to make sure that we know that we are professing a God who matters now is what we do in this daily part. And so much of our environmental care is not just for non-human creatures and panda bears and starving zebras and things like that, which are really important, but it's to look at how much is sea level rise impacting low-lying island nations and causing people to flee. You know, how much are the deserts expanding in Africa and Asia and causing people to flee? You know, the more conservative estimate is that between 200 and 250 million people will be migrating by the end of the century. We've never seen human migration like that before. A group at Cornell thinks that that number is off by a scale of 10, that we're actually closer to 2 billion people that may be migrating due to climate change by the end of the century. If the resurrection matters, then what I tell those people the good news is matters. And their ability to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, and to have access to decent food, to me, is good news in an age of climate change. And so to me, all of those things sort of wrap up into what that matters, that resurrection hope. If God has really won, then let us go out and be great the way that God has dared us to be great.
All right, so I want to challenge you a little bit on that in just a moment, but before I do, I want to give Doug a chance to speak out, not only as a theologian, but as an exegete on what you might add to this dialogue.
Well, I'm just enjoying listening to them talk and learning a lot, so in a sense I hate to take up their time. But just to echo some of the things that they have said, my location is in evangelical Christianity. That's who I've been, who I still am. That's the kind of circles I move in. And I'm deeply concerned about trying to help that segment of the population understand how serious climate change is. It's an issue that's harder to get people to appreciate because they can see a homeless person on the street and they can be motivated to do something about that. But you don't see climate change so clearly. Remember, we're not talking about the change in weather. We're talking about change in climate, which by definition means over time. And it's not the kind of thing you see day to day. It's the kind of thing you say, oh, isn't it interesting, when my wife and I were in Alaska in 2008, there are a lot fewer glaciers in Portage Lake than there were in 2001 when we were there. Isn't that interesting? So it's over time you see that effect, but to get people to come to grips with that, one of the things I have argued is that biblical wisdom, among other things, involves understanding our world in such a way that we can react to it as God wants us to. How do we understand our world? Scientists give us the information about our world that in a biblical sense is the wisdom we require to know how to act righteously, how to respond to God. But the frustration of getting people on board with that is tough. The book that my son and I wrote is a biblical theology of creation care. So we're trying to take people through Scripture from beginning to end and try to help them see that the material world has always been a significant part of what God is doing. He cares for it. He cares for it. We should care for it as well. So wisdom, the biblical teaching about the importance of creation and the redemptive work of God in this world, and then what I like to call other regard. The word we used to use was love, and that's a great word, which we should still continue to use, but it's a bit of a debased word, isn't it? Because we use it so much, we talk about it as an emotion, maybe it doesn't have the impact it needs to have. So with other theologians, I like to talk about the New Testament call for us to have other regard, that the Christian is by definition fundamentally one who by God's grace has been turned away from looking at himself or herself and looking at others, whoever those others might be, neighbors right next door or people in Bangladesh who are going to be so dramatically affected by climate change with the rising of the oceans. The city of Miami, I saw recently, is spending $200 million to raise highways because they know the ocean is coming. You know what? People in Dhaka probably don't have $200 million to spend to raise their land. And so for Christians to be serious about their faith means having regard for those others, understanding from the science what is happening and what we can do about it. If I go to a doctor and he tells me, you've got this problem in your body and it's a serious one, and if you don't do something about it, you're going to be in trouble. I say, okay, I'm getting a second opinion. Second doctor says the same thing. I'm still not so sure. I'm going to a third doctor. Same thing. That's what happens if you ask climate scientists what's going on in our world. You can go down the list of 15, 20, 30, 50 climate scientists. They're all going to say basically the same thing. There are some serious issues in our world created by climate change that have the potential of bringing tremendous harm and death to, as we've been talking about already, many, many people in the future. So, I'm sorry, I've gotten on my soapbox a bit, but it's frustrating to me that people just seem not to want to pay serious attention to what the credible scientists in the field are teaching on this. We don't do that in other areas of life. We trust the science, even if there's suspicion of the scientists, as Elaine was saying. We trust the science and make a lot of fundamental life decisions based on that science. But suddenly we come to this area and we say,
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the connection.
You said suddenly we come to this area and Siri thought you were talking to her.
I think actually it's my wife who programs that when I've talked too long. So. Thank her or blame her, however
Jenny, we were happy with him talking. Okay, so you've opened up a couple of doors I want to walk through. And I do want to return to pushing a little bit on some that's been said, because I think it's a natural push that many people will be having in their heads.
That's
so
right.
I want to bring it out to the front and let y'all address it. But before we do, I've got to get on my soapbox for a moment. Dick, there you are. Genesis 2:15. One of the earliest instructions, I dare say the earliest instruction God gives, is for Adam, humanity, to avad and shamar the earth. Avad is a Hebrew word that means to work. The word slave comes from it. A vineyard worker, avad's the vineyard. It's someone who tills the ground, sows the seed, and it is to toil in the ground, to take care of the garden, if you will. And then the second word that's used is this word shamar. Now, I don't know what you use with your Hebrew students, but when I was studying Hebrew, that was one of our paradigm verbs. Shamar ti, shamar ta, shamar, all of that stuff. Shamar is, in other words, you learn that the first week of Hebrew. Shamar is typically translated guard. Now, Adam and Eve weren't being told to guard the garden. Like space invaders were going to be coming and they were going to get ready to zap them out of the sky, or the lions would come in. Heavens, they were naming the lions. So I thought that there's got to be more to this word shamar. So through my friend Andrew McIntosh and through some others, I really pushed on trying to understand this word, did a word study on it. And it's interesting, Isaiah uses it over and over for the watchmen of a city, because they're the guards of the city. But what it means at its root is this idea of looking at something and making an intelligent assessment of it, so that you can do what needs to be done to keep things right. So the watchmen that Isaiah talks about, they shamar the city, but they do it by watching. And when someone comes up to the gate, they intelligently assess whether or not to open the gate for that person, or whether or not to sound the alarm because the dust coming up appears to be a foreign army, or whatever it may be. They look intelligently and they guard and they assess. And that's the command that humanity was given for the environment, for the world. That we're not only supposed to work it, but we're supposed to do it with an intelligent inspection, trying to figure it out. I think it's the Christian basis for science and understanding how the world works. But I think it's also the Christian obligation for stewardship over the environment. Now the question then becomes, how do we do that in a responsible way, and yet in a way that doesn't turn into an extremism that by default is destructive to the overall scheme. So here's my pushback. I'm off my soapbox now. I just became a panelist. 1980, I took a course entitled Environmental Economics. We were taught to put pollution on a supply and demand curve. And I remember at first thinking, a demand for pollution? Who's got a demand for pollution? We absolutely have a demand for pollution. And environmental economists learned to put it on a supply and demand curve. We can eliminate all pollution from a coal mine, or a coal plant. You can burn coal with no pollution. The problem is the electricity would be so exorbitant no one would ever want it. So people are willing to tolerate a little bit of pollution because the price for getting rid of that little bit seems to be outweighed. You take the cost of putting in solar panels everywhere. Well, when you add together the cost of what it takes to mine to get the materials for the solar panels, you start adding it up. Where does it make economic sense? Where doesn't it? So you've got the large-scale macro balancing to be done, but you've got it on an individual basis too. Do you walk to the grocery store to get your groceries instead of drive? Well, if you walk, it will take 3 hours. If you drive, it'll take 10 minutes. That's 3 hours away from your family. Is it worth it? Where do you draw that line? What are you willing to say is on a micro scale, not macro, but micro? How do you find that line that says, okay, here's balance. This is good stewardship. I'm guarding, I'm taking care of, and yet I'm also using the earth in a way that is God's gift to us to make the world a better place. So that's my challenge. Chris?
I start?
Yes.
Is this the advantage of being the youngest? Is that I get to start with the hard question?
I've always said Elaine was younger than you. Don't lay that one on me, brother.
So I get that question all the time from students, and they want to know, what I do and what I don't do, and why I carry this around, and does this make me a self-righteous person or not? And I guess I asked a different sort of question to get at that. Katharine, when she gets here tomorrow, will tell you, Texas is leading the U.S. in wind energy, right? How is it that the Texas ethos of independence has led to this incredible gain in wind energy when the rest of the country could be doing wind energy and doesn't? Why is California not leading the country in solar panel production? You could go to that macro level very quickly, and I'm happy to do that at some level. But I think the bigger question that I start asking students is, why do we drive anyway? Why do we live so far away from everything to begin with? Why do we even have plastic water bottles? We have a lot of things in our lives that are disposable for convenience sake rather than anything else. We live far away from everyone in our families sometimes because we prize mobility and we prize job opportunities, and we want to have room between our neighbors, and we don't want to actually live next to people. There's lots of big questions that we could be asking, and you go to places like Europe and you go, well, they really like old stuff, and so they're not willing to tear down old stuff to live far apart. And we had a different kind of experience here in the States. So I think those bigger questions are ones that we need to think about asking as a society. Why do we think that energy is so expensive, or clean energy is so expensive? Well, it's actually not. Solar power and wind energy in most states now is outstripping coal mining and other types of energy, natural gas, et cetera. So I think there is a time when your cost-benefit curve or your supply-demand curve is starting to catch up with clean energy is becoming bigger, but that's still, I think we have to kind of come to grips with the bigger question, which is, we go back to the theological one. Could we justify, if God was to return to us just and be in our face right now, and we say, justify what we're doing around the planet today? I don't know if I as a Christian could. We're in the sixth great extinction of this planet, and we know it's caused by humans. So we're not really obeying the let everything else flourish commandment that was repeated, not in just Genesis 1, but that Noah gets over and over again in the Noahic covenant. We are allowing people around the planet to starve and we have more deaths around the planet from air pollution than we have a lot of other things. So as we think about these sorts of things, I think that's a really interesting starting point, is what does it mean to guard the planet? What does it mean to do these sorts of things? And what does that look like in your daily life? I don't think the average Christian can say much on that theologically. And then you ask that God question. I think my students are really kind of grappling with that when they say that. Could you justify your behavior to God right now when it comes to all this other stuff that you're supposed to care for? And that strips away the politics, and that maybe is more of an individual frame, but you could blow that up to a church frame. You know, lots of churches here in Texas take up huge amounts of land, huge amounts of energy, lots of air conditioning, lots of other things. Could you justify this to God? I think there's some really powerful questions to answer at that level. Do I have air conditioning in my house? Yeah, and when it gets over 80 degrees in my house, I turn on the air conditioning. But that's not the only thing that I should be thinking about. I should be thinking about, I have the money to go on vacation all the time. Should I really be putting that carbon in the air? That should be an actual question that I think someone living in the 21st century with a fair amount of financial resources should ask oneself. How much meat should I eat? Should it actually be a question that we ask as Christian people here and now in the 21st century, where that is one of the leading polluters on the planet? I mean, I think those kind of broad questions get at to your concern. Is it like, what does it mean? I'm not a big fan of the steward language. In the book, I talk about how stewarding natural resources only came into Christian language in about 1600. So the first 1600 years or so, the idea of stewardship was only a financial term, and it was a financial between masters and slaves. And so lots of folks have really avoided that. So I just say, I'm not really a big fan of the stewarding natural resources. I'm a big fan of just acting human. And acting human has to do with this kind of stuff that you're talking about. And me as a scientist, this is probably where my bias is. I take Ellen Davis, the famous biblical scholar at Duke, when she says part of the relationship between those words that you used in Hebrew have to do with this reciprocal relationship. Humans do something and the earth does something. The earth does something and humans do something. And I think she's right. We are not watching for what the earth is telling us is going on. You know, we are not watching for the fact that there is billions and billions of creatures in one little tiny centimeter of soil that it could tell us more about what's going on in God's plan than sometimes the biggest, most majestic kind of chapels that we have. And yet we don't have that kind of interdependent link that Scripture talks about, that we are all part of this together. We're all part of creation that is going to be pulled forward to the end. And we have a special role to play in it. But are we even looking at the biblical language of what that special program is in really profound ways? I'm not as convinced.
All right, so I want to give you all a chance to go on that and not just engage in the dialogue, but in the process of it, do either of you want to take up the vanguard of saying there is such a room for moderation in how we do this? And by that I mean, I know some people who are marvelously convicted about this and are vegan because they are not going to eat meat. They don't think meat is useful, and they won't even eat meat byproducts because they think it's wrong. And they would consider someone who says those things and yet eats meat to be a lightweight on this issue. Then I've got, and I can say that carefully knowing that these people, at least one of them is very close to me. And then I've got other people who consider this person a lightweight because this person may not be willing to eat meat and meat byproducts, and yet live so frugally and carefully that they buy cheap clothing, which is made by slave labor. Instead of buying clothing that costs enough money that it's made by people who can earn a living off of it, instead of just making money for the capitalistic stores and owners that are taking advantage of cheap foreign labor. And then I know some other people who are very concerned because they actually buy coffee. It's not a necessary drink. And if they didn't buy coffee and gave that money to some of the street people, we wouldn't have as much of a homeless problem. And then I know some other people who think that it's okay to buy the coffee and it's okay to wear cheap clothes as long as they don't take an airplane and they drive. So is anybody willing to speak up for moderation on any of this, that there is room in Christian understanding and theology for you to assess things and say, okay, there's room here. You know, I don't want to go overboard, but God doesn't expect you to be miserable, and somewhere in the midst of this, these are resources, whether you use the word steward or not. They're things that have been given to humanity to make the world a better place. Anybody? Either of you two?
I will say that our survey and interview work would show that an argument for moderation would get more traction. Does that make sense? So if you wanted to really convince people to be more involved in environmental care efforts, that efforts which seem extreme quickly also seem political or polarizing, which the everyday Christian is very skittish about. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's actually, so I don't want to so much fight for moderation as I want to say that would be a strategic move. Yeah. If we wanted people to get more convinced. Another thing that Chris kind of mentioned, but I wanted to amplify a little bit, is most Christians do not think that climate change hurts people. They think it's sort of a luxury issue that's related to the environment, and in general that caring for the environment is kind of a luxury issue. And so I wanted, this group is perhaps not typical of everyday America, if that makes sense. I mean, people who would come and listen to a lecture and listen to 3 academics on a panel. You are a very special and lovely group of people, and bless you. I mean, I love that you're here. But everyday people are not thinking about climate change and environment as being issues related to harm for humans. And so I wouldn't want to assume that we're all on the same page in the Christian community about that. If I may, I want to read an excerpt from an interview that I did where I asked a youth minister in a church about how he views environment and climate change. And he said he was actually angered when people donate to environmental charities rather than what he calls more humanitarian causes. He said, it makes me kind of upset because you have those commercials for people to donate to sort of environmental thing when someone could be donating to give money toward a starving child or children with AIDS or that sort of thing. So I feel like in the environmental movement, there's a higher value placed on the planet than on human life. And that just came up over and over again. There's not a very good connection between environmental care and care for humans. And Christians are taught consistently that we need to be caring for each other. So it sort of helps me actually decrease cynicism a little bit for Christian communities that
Katharine Hayhoe is in the house.
All right.
Hello, Katharine. Good to see you. Thank you so much. Please come. This is your seat. We've kept it warm. Okay. Catherine, you're sitting next to, watch your step, to Chris and Elaine and Doug. So, and you came at a perfect time.
I did.
So get comfortable for just a moment because we're coming right to you with a question. Okay. But first we give you a plastic bottle of water.
Or
and,
not. No, that's okay.
All right. And so within the framework of that, continue, Elaine. I want to make sure you have a chance to seal that.
I think it's important to bring that up, that some of our theological training and even our scientific training, I mean, Katharine does this extremely well in her work, to show people that being concerned about climate change is to also be concerned about the world's poorest of the poor, about humanity. That's not a given. It's not a given that Christians think that. So that's what our polling work would show just over and over again, that people do not think this is a humanitarian issue. Right. And so there needs to be some information there as well. Also, another side issue is we're talking very structural. We're talking about like, oh, if I fly, what does that do for my carbon footprint? Everyday Christians do not think very much in terms of structural impact. We tend to think in terms of, in the evangelical circle, who can I witness to? If a person seems to have need, could I give to them? So I think just understanding where people are coming from can help us reach them a little bit better sometimes.
One of the reasons for our dialogue and for this weekend. So thank you for that. All right. So Doug, weigh in here, the younger statesman that you are.
I'm not sure I want to be the voice of moderation. You asked that. But at least for the circles I move in, with the evangelical Christians I am familiar with, I think it's going to have to be moderation in moving people to the place we might ultimately want them to be. I think Elaine's research is showing that. And so my concern, and I've taught this in my own church, falling on deaf ears to some extent, I'm afraid, is that when you think about the way you live, the way you vote, this whole issue of environmental concern, creation care, including climate change, should be one of those issues that you think about in making all those decisions. That's all I want people to do, just a very simple thing. Add that to the list of things that we as evangelical Christians think about when we make lifestyle decisions, choices about what to purchase, choices about what house to buy, what car to buy. I'm probably one of the few people in the world that thinks the WWJD campaign, What Would Jesus Drive, was actually a good idea. To try to get people to think along those lines. And again, it's the elephant in the room. We all know that some of the issues we face are so large, they can only be handled at the level of government and international policy. That means inevitably that Christians have to bring that perspective into the ballot box with them. It's not the only thing maybe they're concerned about, but it needs to be on the list. And that's my concern for many of the Christians I know. That's not even something they consider as a factor that should influence them.
All right, so Katharine, here's the question that was on the table, and I'll throw it to you. Somewhere everybody draws lines. For some, it's I won't fly if I can avoid it. For some, we drive electric cars because we're not going to drive, if we can avoid it, the fossil fuel burning cars. Some won't eat meat. Some won't drink out of a plastic water bottle, or only do it if there's a certainty that it will be recycled, which, by the way, we do recycle, everybody. Some serve plastic water bottles, but at least we recycle them, though there's probably pollution involved in the recycling. There are different lines of extremeness that people will follow. I want to know how you compute those lines for yourself, and how Andrew, your husband, does, and what you do with your children, and how do you decide what is okay and what you're going to try and avoid? How do you draw those lines?
Well, what's really interesting with the discussion that I just came in on is that I've been to 4 very different places in the last 24 hours. So yesterday morning, I was speaking at the American Museum of Natural History, which is home to Neil deGrasse Tyson. Then yesterday night, I was speaking at the United Nations Environment Program. Then this morning, which is why I am arriving now, I was speaking at the Texas Tribune Festival on political climate. And now we are here talking about climate change from a Christian perspective. And what is absolutely fascinating to me is that the main themes that I heard, and I made myself, but other people brought up too, at each one of these 4 events are the ones that we heard right now as I walked in the door. First of all, the concept that climate change is not only a science issue, it is not only an environment issue, it is an issue of our health, of our water, of our economy, of our national security, of poverty, of hunger, of everything that makes us human, and it is a humanitarian issue at its core. So that is something that I'm hearing everywhere, and the fact that you hear the same message in all these really different places, I think, is really encouraging. And then, I would say the #1 question that I hear, and I heard this every single place, including just now, is should we be doing individual action or should we be doing system-wide change? And the answer to that, first of all, is yes. But as Christians, I think we can go even a little bit further, and that's why I'm glad that this is discussion number 4, because we can go another level deeper on that question. And the way I go deeper is this: what image does the Bible use for the church? Of a body, right? And it talks extensively on how each of us has a different function. There are eyes, there are hands, there are feet. There are some that appear to be more important, but others that are more lowly, which are essential. So as Christians, we know that there's not this new list of 10 green commandments because we are all extremely different. We have all been given these talents and these abilities that are completely different from anyone else, and we are all called to do something different with them. So when people say, well, what can I physically do in my life? I used to think the most important thing to do was to step on the carbon scales to reduce our carbon footprint. But then I realized that as individuals, we don't have enough leverage to change the whole world. And then I looked at the public opinion survey data, and I'll show a little bit of that tomorrow night, that shows that when you ask people a bunch of questions like, do you think the planet is warming? Yes. Do you think it's going to harm people in developing countries? A lot of people actually do think that. Do you think it's going to affect us here? Everybody says no. And then do you ever talk about it? Not at all. So I think the most important thing that we can do is talk about it. Talk about it individually and in our organizations. Vote, as you were just saying. And also make simple choices in our lives that show that we are walking the walk that we're talking as well. So, so what we do is, it's not, like I said, it's not 10 Green Commandments. Every year I try to do 1 or 2 new things and just kind of add them to my life. So, for example, the biggest part of my personal carbon footprint is my travel. So I've transitioned about 80% of the talks I give to virtual talks. And when I do travel, I always bundle events together. So I'm doing a ton of events in one place at the same time. I just broke my record recently. 2 weeks ago, I went to Alaska and I did 30 events in 5 days.
Wow.
So the average carbon footprint was as if I took my little plug-in hybrid car and I drove from Lubbock to Abilene to do a presentation. Like, that was the average carbon footprint of each event. Food waste is a huge source of heat trapping gas emissions. If food waste were its own country, it would be number 3 after China and the US. So I realized that I used to shop every 2 weeks. I would fill up the fridge, we would eat our way through, and about 1/3 of the food would go bad. So I stopped doing that. Now I only go to the grocery store and I get 2 bags of food. I go to one on the way home from the university, and I go every 2 or 3 days, and we eat a lot more healthy. We also eat a bit lower down the food chain because we have more fresh fruits and vegetables, and we don't have the food waste. So my plan this year was reducing food waste and recycled toilet paper. But then, just before Christmas, I got a call from a credit agency that said, somebody pulled your credit report. And I said, oh my gosh, identity theft. So I said to Andrew, my husband, I said, I think that my identity's been stolen. I think we should look into this. And he said, no, I know about this. I was like, what do you mean you know about this? He's like, it's okay. I'm like, no, it's not okay. He's like, no, don't worry about it, I have this. I'm like, well, what do you mean you have this? Starting to get a little bit nervous here. So he's like, I can't tell you. I said, well, I think you have to tell me. It's my credit rating. And he's like, no, I'm not going to tell you. So he finally cracked on Christmas Eve. And that was when I found out that he had got us solar panels for Christmas. And not only that, but he got them from Mission. He got solar panels for Christmas for our house. And he got them from a company called Mission Solar in San Antonio. And the last time oil prices dropped, a bunch of people lost their jobs out in West Texas. And so Mission Solar took in a bunch of out-of-work oil patch workers and retrained them to do solar panel manufacturing in San Antonio to create real jobs in Texas. And we were able to support that by purchasing their panels. So.
Fantastic. All right. So tomorrow night, by the way, after Katharine's lecture, we will have Q&A. So be thinking now, because your questions may come up during this session as well. Be thinking about what questions you might want to ask, and be prepared to ask those tomorrow night. So let's see how we're doing time-wise. We're doing okay. We're doing okay. So here's my next question. I'm curious whether or not each of you are committed Christians who care about the science that has produced a problem and is now seeking a solution to the problem, namely that of climate change. Science has done a lot more than simply create and identify and perhaps solve that problem. There are lots of other science issues on the table. And I'm curious if any of you are engaged in thought in any of these other areas. I will throw out a couple. Artificial intelligence, gene splicing, recombinant DNA, whatever you want to call it. those are two examples. I can come up with more if you want them. But within the framework of our Christian response to how we handle this world, I'd love to know, and since we've just hit Katharine up for the last one, why don't we start at this end and we'll work down towards her. Has your work, either as theologian, as sociologist, exegete, whatever, has your work looked at those issues, or are you considering those issues as you work through this stuff?
If you mean the two issues you just mentioned, my answer would be no. I've not really dealt with those in terms of the work I've been doing recently.
Well, how about are there other science issues that have engaged you as an exegete?
To some degree. For instance, I've been involved a little bit in the issue about a historical atom that's come up recently that many of us will know about. I've been asked to contribute to a couple of conferences on that issue from the standpoint of what Paul is teaching about Adam, or what his theology might require us to affirm about Adam. So I have been involved in that a bit.
Have you looked at that from a science perspective as well, of trying to chart through the chromosomal determinations of...
Oh yes, I am very good at that stuff, so the simple answer is I've tried to read respectable scientists on that issue and trying to identify people who are sensible about it. We all know that when a scientific discovery first hits, there can be a lot of publicity, a lot of media attention, and sometimes that will become imbalanced or extreme, and sometimes it takes a few years to settle down and figure out, okay, now as other scientists look at that and evaluate it, what really is the situation. So, you know, I think to some degree, some of the scientists I read think we're still in the shaking out period on that issue. I'm not a scientist, though. I have to trust the people that know the fields. And I think that can be the frustration for some of us. Who do I know to trust? What source do I go to read on an issue that I have no expertise whatsoever on, but I want to get a sense of what the responsible majority opinion is here. I think that's one of the challenges we face, not only, by the way, in science, but in our public discourse in general these days, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Doug. Elaine.
I've studied all of them. I mean, not all of science, but a lot of science issues. I don't know what do you want to know about?
This could go for a few hours.
Yeah. The true pollster here in our midst. Okay, so tell us how you have done a remarkable job with every question I've asked you at giving. At giving what your polling results have indicated is the general view of Christians here, or the general view of scientists there. Remarkable. And you've managed to escape without telling us any of your personal opinions, which is also somewhat remarkable. So I don't want to make you cross that line.
Yeah.
I'm going to let you stay in your niche that you are comfortable in, but I'm going to do it with a little bit of a challenge. So here's the challenge. Tell us some of the statistics about these issues of other scientific endeavors that you found either surprising or alarming. So maybe there's a personal filter.
Could I tell you my personal views first? Would
yes!
that be okay? Yeah.
That would be great!
You're not America's top trial lawyer for nothing.
Come to it!
I would feel like you asked me, okay. The things, I mean, I have a child, and the things that, as a Christian, kind of keep me up at night, to be honest, is climate change. I live in Houston, Texas. I personally experienced flooding. I also worry a lot about something we haven't talked about yet, is that my research does show that, in particular, African American and Latino Christians do not feel like this is a top issue for them, because they just have so many more important things to think about, they think. And so I've started to wonder if and I don't want to make it seem like race and class are always bundled together, because they're not. But if we think about poverty in general in the US, maybe those of us who have more money have more responsibility as part of the body of Christ to care about certain kinds of structural issues and use our resource. Maybe we have an extra special responsibility. I sort of started to think about that. So maybe if I can use my car less, and I have a more flexible job as a professor, and I make more money as a professor, and maybe I have an extra special responsibility. So I'm sort of thinking about that as a Christian a lot. And I do think, I want to be sensitive to where you want to go with the panel, Mark, but I do think issues involving human reproductive genetic technologies, and we start thinking about where we are going with science that not only changes us genetically in terms of the current generation, but changes the future of the human genome and what that means in terms of playing God. We just did a series of lectures on that topic, both at my church and at Rice University last week. And I think there is place where even science is very concerned right now. What are we doing with these technologies, and where would we go as scientists for deep ethical reflection? I will say in a kind of meta way, the sets of the scientific technologies and issues that most concern Christians are the ones that seem to have to do with who God is and who humans are. Those two central theological issues, I mean, that are the core to our faith, you know, who God is in the world, how he interacts in the world, and who human beings are, and our fundamental uniqueness. So that's why we do worry about evolution. And because the evolution has been tied to those things, has been tied to who God is in the world, and has been tied to who humans are. I have my own views on all of that, but that is an issue that still worries many Christians. We worry about human reproductive genetic technologies because that seems to get at the very core of playing God and the uniqueness of humans and what it means to be made in the image of God, and how much humans can manage being made in the image of God for other humans, right? Like how much control we have over one another. And we worry about climate change in that same sort of way, although as I brought up earlier, climate change is much more related to politics for some people than faith. So regardless of your political ideology, if you go to church more, so this is actually very interesting, if you're actually a part of a community, you tend to be more accepting of climate science. It's very interesting that people, so there is this kind of Al Gore effect, as I don't want to say I hate Al Gore or anything, but this had come up a lot for Christians, that they said, gosh, you know, this is so tied to scientists' liberal political agenda, we're really suspicious. And so that's why I started calling it the Al Gore effect. I'm like, talk about theology, not politics. That's what you need to do to convince Christians. I rambled.
No, that was marvelous. That was just brilliant. Thank you for that. I'm serious.
Thank you for letting me kind of...
No, look, that's what we're here for. All right, Chris, I'm dying to hear your answer to this, because you teach students. You've got an undergrad degree in biology. Yep. You know, if we look, for example, at what Elaine was just discussing, she served this up for you. I've got a very good friend whose wife carries a genetic disorder. That means if she has a male child, that male child will have issues that will keep that child from being able to speak, being able to walk, being able to function, and probably being able to live past the 3rd decade. So only if they have a female child. And we're reaching a point genetically where they can ensure that she has a female child. And is that an okay thing to do? Or does she, you know, or how about the Chinese scientist who's able to change the genetic code and make someone immune to the AIDS virus? And so we can do that alteration and put them back in. Do you, as a theologian / interested in science professor, ever delve into areas beyond simply climate change?
Yes.
All right. Well, great.
Yeah.
Okay, Katharine. That brings us to you. No. Could you elucidate a little bit on that?
As I tell my students, I went yes, comma, and then sort of after.
Very good.
Yeah. So my field started in evolutionary biology, and so I started in that way as an undergrad, and then so I stayed in graduate school. studied a lot about it was the beginning of stem cell therapies and such, and studied with one of my graduate advisors who had received money from the National Institutes of Health to try to talk about the ethics of those things. So I was on the beginning end of that, beginning edge of that. So those sorts of things like you're mentioning, I think are worthwhile pursuits in some really important ways, because of, back to what Elaine said about what does it mean to be human? You know, we've been asking that question for roughly 15,000 years or so of modern Homo sapiens sapiens, you know, and we're not going to stop asking that question anytime sooner. My biggest concern in that particular issue is not whether we can or cannot do it. That's probably a technical question that'll get answered on its own, but should we do it? And what kind of justice questions will it have? What, will we end up doing what sci-fi writers have been predicting for 75 years, which is we'll have an upper class of sort of superhumans, as it were, and everyone else, you know? And so I'm very concerned about that in a general sense of how do Christians come at this as not just a financial issue. Do I have the money to get this? But how do I understand if I have the money to do this and a lot of other people don't, what is that going to look like down the road, whether it's for therapy reasons or the inheritable issues in germline and such. So that's one set of issues. But on the evolutionary biology thing, I mean, that's still there in the sense of many Christians, I think, still don't accept climate science, not just for the politics, but because they've wrapped up all of these science things into the godless atheist scientists, which is why Katharine's so weird to so many people, right? That she is not godless or atheist. And you have this kind of weird kind of meta thing going on where I have to sort of settle between, I mean, I have a group of students I just met with a couple days ago. Am I going to be a faithful person or am I going to be a scientist? And, you know, I've spent, 12 years of my professional career and then the 20 years before that thinking about it. When my preacher told me you have to make that decision, and I think that's, to me, is bigger in the sense of we're the first, it's only about the last 100 years or so that Christians have ever told other Christians to make that decision.
That's right.
Yeah.
From Augustine on, this is how God made the world. Let's figure it out. And that has nothing to do at all with your understanding of who God is, other than, wow, God's even more marvelous than I thought. God's even more awesome than I thought. So I think that's a big one, a meta thing. On another slight from the evolutionary biology is thinking, I get questions about GMO all the time, and particularly GMO foods. And so when you're the only person that teaches about climate change at a university, you become the eco-judge of everything. So I get like, is this making me a good person?
Do you get a special hat?
No, I have not at this point. If it was, it would be not a hat I'd want to wear probably because of the looks I get. But I think that's a big one that we sort of think about, because GMOs are being sold now, as they have been for 50 or so years in various forms, as the thing that's going to fix starvation, the thing that's going to fix this. And maybe that's where I didn't get to answer your temperance question earlier. Maybe there needs to be temperance in that. GMOs are probably not an all or nothing thing, although what I'm concerned about as a former evolutionary biologist is once those things get out into the wild, what are they going to do to the evolutionary pathways of everything else that we need? We are killing off biodiversity, not just intentionally, but unintentionally around the planet. And that evolutionary bank of DNA that God has given this creation, we're going to need for climate change-related agriculture reasons. And we tend to think that we can kind of create our way out of this. And most scientists who are on the ground will tell you that's not the case. And so how do we think about things like that? I think, go back to Elaine's comment, it was so good. Who we think God is and who we think we are is still one of the most relevant, or two of the most relevant questions that we as Christians should be telling to everyone that's Christian or not in our communities. We have some really important answers to these kind of questions.
So I don't want to, I want to be careful not to get into Katharine's lecture tomorrow night. I have no clue what you're going to say. So I'll tread lightly here, but to reinforce what you're saying, I know a number of studies that have indicated that climate change itself is causing alterations in the crops, in the sense that the exact same crop that used to be growing this wheat is changing its proportion of carbohydrates to proteins because of the effective climate change that we've got. And so the need for biodiversity to handle what's coming seems to me a very sensible subject. I'm glad you added to the equation. So I'll let you off the hook there. But Katharine, now here you are. Time Magazine has constantly put you on the list of the top 100 influential women in the world, and all the rest of this. And you are known as Dr. Climate Change, okay, with an evangelical twist. Are there other issues of science that have piqued your interest where you believe as a Christian you may need to, want to, or one day engage in or urge others to engage in?
Well, first of all, it absolutely mystifies me that so many of us believe that studying God's creation, which is what science is, could somehow be against what God wants us to do. If we truly believe that God created this universe, then how could studying his creation in any way conflict with his written word? Now, sometimes, of course, they appear to conflict, and we can all think of examples. But when they do so, is it not because of our incomplete understanding of the science in some cases, our incomplete understanding of the Bible in other cases, often both? Some of those are resolved within our lifetime. Some of them will not be resolved till we get to heaven, and then I think it'll all be 100% clear. But just starting from that basic premise, I think, would really change our perspectives, rather than starting from the premise that people are in conflict.
Yeah, that's right.
So I love Elaine's work, and I use it in some of my presentations, and this is the really interesting thing. I've started to use it in presentations at big public universities. So big public universities, not Christian colleges, people are really starting to get interested in, is this whole idea that science and faith are in conflict valid? And so Elaine's work shows that 50% of us research scientists identify with a specific religious label. Is it still 50%? Okay. And 70% view ourselves as spiritual people. So then at a public university, I survey people in the audience. I have a really cool tool where you can survey people with their phones so people can respond anonymously, and I get the same numbers.
Oh, that's great.
Wow.
I've done it at places like Oklahoma University, I've done it at Rutgers, I've done it everywhere, and I get like to within 2 or 3 percentages, which is crazy. So first of all, that's just kind of the basic idea that we have. And then second of all, I attend a conference, and several of you do too, a number of years, called the American Scientific Affiliation, and it's scientists who are Christians. There is the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation, and there are Christians in Science in the UK. And I love going there because that's where you have scientists studying everything. Everything. And each talk addresses both the science of what they do and the ethical, moral, or theological implications of what they do. And I am just fascinated by it. I always try to go to as many different ones as I can. So, you know, the ethical implications of GMOs, for example. Or one time, I was in a lecture on the theological implications of parallel universes. And the guy beside me was muttering under his breath the whole time, and I realized why, because it turned out he was the next speaker. And he and his colleague disagreed over whether there are parallel universes or not. But they presented the science very clearly on the pros and cons, and then they really got into the theological implications and the fact that some of the top cosmologists in the world, which is what these two men are, were thinking deeply about, if there were parallel universes, would there be life? If there was life, did Christ die for them too? How does that all work? My experience has been that I am not a unicorn. I can't go to a single scientific meeting these days without at least 1 or 2, and often more, colleagues, all the way from students to senior scientists, coming up to me and saying, I'm a Christian too. I have a list now of several hundred scientists who study climate change, who are all Christians from across the whole spectrum, from Pentecostal to Catholic and everything in between. But we exist. There's a lot of us. And every single one of us is studying this because of who we are, not in spite of who we are. And one of the most interesting conversations that I had was at a scientific conference a couple of years ago. A colleague asked me to have lunch. And this is pretty common, but usually only when you're working on a project together. And I wasn't working with anything on him. And he didn't say why he wanted to have lunch. So I was like, okay, sure, I mean, I know you, why not? So I show up and I sit down, and he leans across the table and he says, I'm not a Christian, but I care too. He says, I care about people. Climate change affects the poorest and most vulnerable people, and that's why I do what I do. In fact, I changed my whole research program to study solutions because I want to help people. I said, yes, of course. So even if we don't ascribe a specific label to ourselves, we're still doing it for the reasons of caring about other people. And that's something that I think is just massively lost in translation. It is not being communicated to people in the church. And I truly feel that our role, and often my role when I'm speaking to people, is to do what it says in the book of James. You know, in James it says, you're like someone who looked in the mirror and then you went away and forgot who you are. I don't think it's our job to change who people are. I think that's God's job. We have been given free will to make a decision, and then if we do make a decision to accept his gift, then he is working through his Spirit in our lives to change our attitudes and our actions and our perspectives. But what we can do is we can be someone who holds up the mirror and reminds people who they are and who God has made them and who God wants us to be.
That's a marvelous, Dick, yeah, Dick. Doug abdicated Hebrew scholarship to Dick Averbeck, who teaches Semitic languages. That's the concept behind being made in God's image, is being a mirror. That I guess if we were using the Septuagint, probably, does image, is it ikonos? Is it, okay?
It's one of the words, yeah.
Yeah. It's the idea that we are a mirror, and we should be reflecting God in this world. And for Adam, that was God names everything in Genesis 1, and then all of a sudden, Adam's made in his image, so Adam can reflect God. So Adam gets to name stuff, and you see the way it starts manifesting itself. All right, we're going to run a little bit over. We try to run this an hour and a half. We're at an hour and a half, but we're going to run a little bit over. If you've got to go, I'm sorry.
The doors are locked.
Yeah, the doors are locked. And, you know, I must tell you, when we built this chapel, it's a replica of a chapel that was built in Cappadocia in 500 AD. And the walls were just about up to here when my wife came out here, and sweet Becky said to me, you've really messed up. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, you realize all the events we're going to have here? And I said, yeah. She said, where are the restrooms? I said, you're right. So we built some out there because I wouldn't destroy the structural integrity of this replica. So sorry, if you need to excuse yourself, go. But here's my last question, and the reason I want to do it, and it was inspired by Katharine's soliloquy just now. I am sure all of you have a good story. A good story of someone you've encountered in this process, of someone you've dialogued with, someone, whether student or faculty, someone you agreed with, someone you disagreed with. Each of you have to have a good story. We're humans. We love stories. So I want you to find a good story about this, as Katharine was able to do, and I'm sure you got plenty more. I wouldn't dump this question on you because that wasn't your free pass. That was your warm-up. You're going to have to do it again too. So I'll let you go in the order you choose as you get your story ready, because it's not fair to spring this on you and then cold call. So who's ready to go with a good story of an encounter with someone on this, on any of the things we've been discussing?
I'll go because it most follows with what Katharine said. If I may I also say an academic thing in response,
sure,
just as a panelist prerogative. So I want to echo what Katharine says very strongly. If any of you are in the science community, I think it's very useful for you to talk about being a scientist in your church. So we find in our research that scientists tend to practice a sort of secret spirituality in their scientific environment. They tend to not talk very much about it because they're afraid of what other scientists will think, and that they tend to practice a secret science in their churches where they don't talk very much about their scientific work. And my husband's a physicist, and it's funny, he read my book and he's like, wow, I kind of do that. I'm afraid that it'll be a little bit overwhelming to people when I say that I'm a physicist, that it might be kind of make them feel kind of funny or something, or because they often say like, oh, I didn't like math very much when I was in school, when he says I'm a physicist. So he's really changed the way, because he says by actually just stating that I am a scientist and that you can be a Christian and a scientist, that paves a way for other people to consider that as a possibility and a way to serve God. So I just want to get that out there. I think this is particularly important for our non-white brothers and sisters. There is a huge lack of minorities in science. When we have interviewed people in both African American and Latino congregations in our studies, we do find that non-white Christians often feel like science is a no trespassing zone, and that they're double minorities, both racially and ethnically, but also as Christians, because people in those communities are much more likely to be Christians than in the general population. So I think that's just really important to think about. I think that's also true with women. In every society, women are more likely to be religious than men. So is there a possibility that this sort of secrecy about the possibility of being a Christian and being a scientist may be keeping out people that we very much want to draw into science? That's the thing. So case in point, I was and I'm sorry to Esmeralda and Bradley, who just heard this story on Tuesday night at a lecture I gave, but it's the one that comes to mind most quickly. I first started being interested as a sociologist in what scientists think about religion. It's kind of weird, my field, because I study people, and also the people that you study can be your greatest teachers of the next study, if that makes sense. Like my respondents or my subjects actually give me ideas about what the next study might be. So I was a young student doing some research in religious organizations, trying to understand how churches and synagogues and other religious organizations respond to changes in family forms in the US, rising divorce rates and things like that. And as part of my research, I needed to actually attend Bible studies and to try to hear things that people were saying about family life. I was at Cornell University in upstate New York, where I did my PhD. I was attending a Bible study in a local church, and I met a woman there who was also in the Bible study, and she says, oh, like, what do you do for your work? You know, what are you doing? And I said, oh, I'm a student. I'm a graduate student at Cornell University. And she says, yuck. And I'm like, okay. I mean, literally the first thing that went through my mind is like, she wanted her kids to go to Harvard. She doesn't think that Cornell is good enough. And so she, and then she says, like, I said, well, why the aversion about Cornell? She says, well, I wouldn't want my kids to go to Cornell University because I'm afraid the scientists there might take them away from their faith. And I thought, wow, is that really true? I mean, is the Christian opinion that scientists are out to eat young Christian children for lunch? I mean, is that kind of a widespread opinion? And that kind of got me started thinking, you know, what does that mean to really study broadly what scientists think about religion and religious people? And it's been a wonderful journey. Yeah.
Wow, that's a great story. All right, Katharine, you have to go last because you're our featured speaker, so that's the only order I'm dictating.
Storyteller.
Yes. So, Chris.
Although I confess that I steal your story and tell it on your behalf sometimes. I think it's such a great story.
I'm so sorry, but it's just dovetailed what you said, so I felt like, oh, I gotta tell that one.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, Elaine has set me up unwittingly again for a good segue. So I have, well, actually for this, I guess none of you are my students. I actually drive a Segway, so that word to me means,
really?
yeah, on campus. I am the Segway professor on campus. That's how I get back and forth to my house because I live on the campus there.
Like the standing thing with the wheels.
Yeah, the standing thing with the wheels. Yep, and I do tricks and the whole bit. Yeah, so.
So you know the owner went off a cliff.
He had a heart attack first.
Okay.
That's we have to know. Yeah, before he went off the cliff, he died before he went off the cliff. So what Elaine said, she was setting me up there. I took two groups of students to New Zealand this past summer, to study climate refugees and creation care issues in New Zealand, and I got one thank you card back that is representative of something that's from the other end of the sociological spectrum. She said, I never knew that my Christian faith could care about these issues. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about whether I could continue to be a Christian if I couldn't care about climate change.
Wow.
And that's just one example from this summer, from many students that I've had in the 12 or 13 years that I've taught this series of classes. And I don't know if our churches realize that if they cannot speak to the entirety of Christian thought, then they might be missing someone. And so picking and choosing which things that you prioritize in your church is what we all have to do. But to completely exclude a category of Christian thought that has been part of the faith for 2,000 years and extending back at least 4,000 years in Judeo tradition, I think is something that we need to think about as we continue to understand our witness. And now at Pepperdine, I have this semester 40 sustainability students in our sustainability program. It's only 4 years old, and I get that story over and over again. I came to a Christian college. It's not known for climate change. I'm thankful that I can at least take one class about it. And how many students now are thinking about staying or going because climate change is part of their education. The second small story, if I may, has to do with, eating is such an interesting part of what we do as Christians and as non-Christians, and because if you think about how much time of your life is spent shopping, preparing, eating, going to the bathroom afterwards, I mean, it's decades of our life. And when I write in the book about this is that, eating is some of the first debates in the Christian world about whether we can eat this or that, and even meat eating was a part of this. And so for about 8 to 10 Wednesdays a semester, my wife and I host a Bible study in our house, and we don't serve meat unless the students want to put in the money that will take to buy meat from the farmer that we use. So it's all grass-fed, it's ethically treated, the workers are paid well, etc. And all of a sudden, they don't want to pay for an $85 piece of skirt steak that would feed 15 to 20 people, because that's putting in money that they might not have. So for the last 10 or so years, we've been cooking mostly plant-rich diets, and it's very fascinating to see how many students show up at 4:30. They cook with me for an hour and a half. We have an hour Bible study, and then sometimes my wife has to kick them out at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Food is so much a part of our experience as human beings, and learning that we can eat in a way that is not only enriching, but generous and full of humility, but also takes into account what's going on the planet is a really, I think, interesting expression of who we are as Christian people that I don't think not enough churches are tapping into. And if I may just highlight, I think just having students in my house to do that all the time is just so impactful to learn not just to cook, but to learn to be with people and to know to talk about important things. And that's one thing that Christians have been doing for quite a long time, and I think we can continue to do it around this topic.
That's fantastic. We're going to switch it over to Doug, but in the process, to reinforce what you said, Chris, I got an email from someone who's here. I won't embarrass her and call her out by name, but I got an email from her excited about the lecture this weekend and saying that if she could get her daughter to come to the lecture with her friends, her daughter might get interested in church again. Yeah. An interesting comment that reinforces what you said. Okay, Doug.
Well, I'm not very good with stories. That's why I don't preach very much. I do have a bit of a story in terms of personal experience. When I moved from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, a seminary, we do theology, Bible, not much else, to Wheaton, which is an undergraduate liberal arts institution. So suddenly I got thrown in with all these strange people, these scientists and English professors and philosophers and so forth. And it was a great experience just to kind of get a bigger sense of these disciplines and how they work. But I remember early on being in a meeting with a scientist who said, "I'm getting so tired of you guys on the Bible side. Because I do my work, I study, I come to conclusions, and you say, that can't be right because the Bible says." Just the frustration that, we're cutting them off at the pass. So you don't have anything useful to say to us. Wheaton's motto is, all truth is God's truth. And without in any way giving up my conviction, which is a strong conviction I have, that the Bible is to be our authority for everything, including matters of science that it touches upon. So without giving up or conceding on that point at all, I began to think of the interpretive process more as a roundabout than a straight line road. I do my biblical exegesis, I move into the roundabout. But then as I move around that roundabout, there are streams from other areas that are entering: science, culture. Those need to be integrated. They don't necessarily trump what I found in Scripture at all, but they need to be integrated, and I need to think about them in light of what I found in Scripture, so that when I ultimately emerge from that roundabout, hopefully on a good route, at least I will have factored in these other things and not simply ignored the other truth that God might be trying to teach us through other means in His Word.
That's fantastic. Thank you for adding that. And from your perspective as a scholar, I think that's a huge thing. One of the things we try to teach within our class, at least, is this concept that Katharine was saying. If you've got that conflict, then you need to study harder on Scripture and study harder on science and ultimately find out the truth. All truth is God's truth. So, Katharine, will you close us with a good story or two?
Sure. So I have a lot of stories, and in fact, I'm writing a book right now with those stories. So how to have positive, constructive conversations with people about an issue that over the last 10 years has become one of, if not the most politically polarized issues in the United States, topping immigration, abortion, and gun control. I mean, that's how polarized climate change is. So when I first started talking about climate change, I just assumed everybody cared for the same reasons I did. Well, it didn't take too many conversations before I figured out that wasn't true. And then I went on to stage 2, which is everybody should care for the same reasons I do. Well, that doesn't work so well either. If you've ever tried to instill new values into anybody over the age of maybe about 12 or perhaps a bit younger, you can't. So that was when it really dawned on me that actually maybe people already have the values they need to care. We just have to connect the dots. So one of the first times I really tried this out was when I got invited to speak at our local Rotary Club in West Texas. And I arrived, and it was a lot of very conservative West Texas business people, and the body language was something like this. And there was a bit of side-eye going on to the woman over here who had invited me. But as I walked into the Rotary Club, now I'm not a Rotarian myself, but as I walked in, they had done the courtesy of printing a giant 5-foot banner with their values on it. It's called the 4-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair? Would it be beneficial to all? And I thought to myself, this is climate change. Is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair? Absolutely not. It affects the poorest and most vulnerable people. Would it be beneficial to do something about it? Yes. So I rearranged my talk into the 4-way test really quickly while they were all eating the chicken buffet. And then I gave this talk, and as I gave the talk, I could see the body language changing. I could see some heads nodding. All of a sudden, people were listening. And at the end, I will never forget a local bank owner coming up to me with the most bemused look on his face. And he said, I never thought too much of this whole global warming thing, which is very polite West Texan for I thought it was a load of crap. But it passed the 4-way test. Like, what can I do? I'm a Rotarian, so clearly I must care about climate change. So that was the first time when I saw the power of this connection, because what did I do? I held up the Rotarian mirror and I connected the dots between Rotarians and climate. So now I'm going to tell you a news story, if I may, from this year. Okay. The news story from this year was I was invited to speak at a very, very conservative Christian college, which I will not name, but it's a very conservative one. I was invited by somebody who I had met at the American Scientific Affiliation, the group of scientists who are Christians. So I love being invited places where you kind of know that most people are hoping you'll say no. My favorite type of invitation is, well, so-and-so at such and such said you were okay, so if you wanted to come, you could. And I'm like, yes, I'm there. So he invited me. I said yes. And then the week before, and this was just a few months ago, the week before I went, he forwarded some emails to me. He said, I thought you should just know. So I opened the emails, and one of them's from the dean, and another one's from another professor, and they say things along the lines of, how dare you invite this woman here to spread Satan's lies on our campus? Don't you know the only solution to climate change is abortion? And to bring somebody, we are horrified, I'm paraphrasing here, but we are horrified that you'd be bringing, so lost in depravity that you'd be bringing somebody to our campus to talk about this. So I said, well, you know, how are you with this? And he's like, oh, no, we're all good. Come on. So I said, okay. So he comes over and picks me up, and we're driving to campus. The phone rings in the car. He puts it on speakerphone. It's the chair of his department. He's like, the local broadcast meteorologist is here, and he wants to talk to her. Don't say anything. It's bad enough that we can't control what she says, but don't you dare say a word to him. Who knows what they'll say about us? So I arrive, and there's the poor local weather guy who follows me on Twitter. He was just there because he wanted a chance to just have a chat. And there's the entire PR team of the university in this circle around him. So we had a nice chat, and I went in. But forewarned is forearmed. So I give different presentations all the time, and I decided it was time for a new presentation. I decided it was time to give a presentation on how climate change is the most profoundly pro-life issue of our day. If we care about life from conception to death, then we would be at the front of the line demanding action on climate change because it affects the unborn, it affects babies, it affects maternal health, it disproportionately affects women and children more than anyone, and it affects us all the way through our lives, and it also disproportionately affects the elderly. So I gave this whole talk on how climate change is a pro-life issue. And I have to say, give these guys credit. Some of the guys who sent the emails showed up at the talk. But I didn't let on that I'd read the emails. And they were polite, they shook my hand, and then the next week, I got another email. The guy who invited me forwarded it. And it was from one of those same people. And he said, well, I went to her talk, and it was pretty good. I understand now. And I was like, well, there we go. That was the mirror, right?
Well, that's fantastic. Would you all join me in saying thank you?